Hey students, this is Peggy Smith. I thought I would just talk to you a little about something that's kind of interesting having to do with maps, because not all maps look like maps. In fact, this book was so interesting to me. It's called Hidden in Plain View, and it's a secret story of quilts and the Underground Railroad. I read it one summer and I was so moved by it that I thought, you know what, I'm going to make an example of a slave quilt so I can explain to students how they use these quilts, older slaves working with younger slaves, and teaching them how to actually do the sewing and quilting and putting them together. They were making blankets for their slave masters' children's beds, really, and the slave masters would even walk back and forth by it to see how everybody was working together. And they were kind of impressed that the older slaves were talking to the younger slaves and showing them this talent they had for making these beautiful blankets. So let me just walk you through it just a bit. Each of the quilt blocks is different and has a different meaning to it. You can read this part later on if you want, but let me explain just a little bit. So this pattern right here is called the monkey wrench. And what you would do is make one block just like this and then make many of them and put them all together. And it makes this really cool pattern, and it's very decorative and so on. Well, if you were walking by and you saw this quilt hanging out on a line to dry, which was very common because, you know, they washed quilts and they hung them out on a clothesline to dry. And so there were always quilts hanging on a line. But if you saw this pattern, it's notifying you that you're going to be leaving in a couple of days. You see, you're trying to make your escape, and you need to understand what the topography of the landscape looks like so you can make it all the way, you know, to the north or wherever you're going. So this is, again, this is telling you, get your tools together, your supplies together. You've got a couple of days and then we're out of here. So in a few days, if you saw this one, this is called tumbling blocks. And if you saw a whole quilt out of this pattern, it's telling you we're leaving tonight. This one is interesting because it's kind of to signify that slaves, as well as Native Americans, could read the sky. They could read the stars. They knew the stars. They knew the formations, and they could use them as maps. Can you imagine traveling only by using stars? Okay, they could do it. Now this block is also telling us how to travel. And for a certain distance, you're going to not want to walk in a straight line across this territory. That you're going to want, it's called the drunkard's path. And look at how these lines zig, you know, kind of, they're certainly not straight, are they? Anyway, so this is kind of signifying that you're going to walk in kind of a weird pattern here because you don't want to be found out. The same is true for this one. This block is telling us, it's called the bear's paw. You can see kind of that looks like a bear's paw. Anyways, and it's telling you for a certain distance that you should travel like a bear, not out in the open. Hide behind trees, bushes, rocks, whatever there is. You're going to have to get through this area very discreetly, not out in the open at all. Now, this was an interesting one too. This is called a bow tie. And sometimes it's used as an hourglass. Can you see how this way it looks more like an hourglass and this way it looks more like a bow tie? Well, as an hourglass, it must have talked about time and that kind of thing. I'm not familiar with those stories. But the one with the bow tie I thought was fascinating. You know, slaves had different shades of skin color. So there were lighter colored slaves and darker colored slaves. And what they would do is a lighter colored slave would dress up like the slave master, very fancy clothes and probably quite a bit taller maybe, and just walk really confidently and so on. And they would take with them this darker colored slave as their slave, and then they could make their way. Okay, so can you imagine how stressful that would be trying to pull this off? So this block, well, I made a big mistake on it, but oh well. So this is really called the flock of geese. But what you're looking at is a compass. Okay, and so you can see we're going 4 different directions here. And it's telling you about direction of travel on your journey. Now, I goofed up because you're supposed to have like one set of red and 3 sets of blue, but that didn't look symmetrical to me, so I put 2 reds and 2 blues. Problem is, I've got you going both north and south, okay, instead of just north or whatever. And lastly, this is my whole slave quilt here. It's called a sampler quilt. And oftentimes when you're first learning to make a quilt, you'll do a sampler quilt. Every block is different. Then you can decide later, well, which block do I really like? Which pattern would I like to see done over and over and over again? So imagine that something like this would be what the older slaves were teaching the younger slaves, how to work on it, and the stories that go with it, and the way of travel and that kind of thing. Now, you would not have this block on your quilt because that would kind of give it away, right? But I put that on there because I wrote the title of the book, which is Hidden in Plain View, and then I put some of the paths that they took. But it is such an interesting book. The stories are incredible. And just imagine, you can't carry this with you. You can't carry any maps with you or anything like that. You've got to know it. You've got to know the terrain. You've got to know how to cross this terrain. You've got to be discreet. You've got to know what to look for. Okay. Anyways, very challenging. I love the idea that this actually is a map to freedom. They don't always look like maps. All right. I'll see you soon.